Residential property values have risen 50% in the past 5 years, but what if you could double that by picking the right locations? I'm Tim Graham and the Property Playbook starts now. A 50% rise in price growth over 5 years sounds strong, but in the right markets, prices more than doubled. Hotspotting's Price Predictor Index has been predicting these suburbs for years. Today, I'm joined by Ryder to explain how following these data-driven insights could turn into extraordinary returns for investors. Terry, welcome to the program.
Hi Tim, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. So Terry, why don't we start, for the people at home that may not know what the Price Predictor Index actually is, could you start by talking us through how does the methodology work?
Look, it's a very simple but very effective methodology where once a quarter we get all the data on how many sales have happened in every significant suburban town across Australia. So we analyse sales activity, sales volumes, because what we know from our many years of experience in doing this is that it's a great forward indicator what will happen with price, because there's always a time lag. The market will shift for whatever reason. Sales activity will start to increase, or if the market's going the other direction, sales activity will start to decrease, and eventually that will translate into a reaction with prices. But usually there's a lag of 6 or 9 months before it shows up in price data. So it's a great way to, if you know what's happening with sales activity figures in a given location, it's a great way to get into a market early or get out of a market early before prices start to change.
Yeah, and I can see how that's important for both homeowners and investors, but on the investor front, obviously having that as a bit of a crystal ball, so to speak, you follow that sales activity, and the rising sales activity you're saying can lead to price growth, is that right?
Well, that's right. It's very, very rare that a location where there's a very strong upward trend with sales activity, which means buyer demand is rising, it's very rare for that to not translate into a reaction with prices. So what we're looking for firstly with the Price Predictor Index is suburbs and local government areas and towns where there's a significant uplift in sales activity quarter by quarter, because we know from experience that that's very likely to translate in, say, 6 months' time into price growth. We're also looking for those locations which are very consistent with their sales activity. There are many locations across the country which are incredibly steady with buyer demand, and those are very safe places to buy, and they are also places that will have good price growth over time. And lastly, we're looking for those locations where there's been a big fall off in sales activity, because that's an early indicator that a boom area are starting to come off the boil. And this new edition of the Price Predictor Index, the spring edition, actually identifies a very significant shift in the regional Queensland market. It was one of the booming areas of Australia where property investors and also lifestyle buyers have been competing for properties in places like Townsville, Rockhampton, Mackay, Gladstone. But this latest analysis shows that the sales activity in those places has fallen off quite significantly, indicating that that particular feeding frenzy is over.
Yeah, okay, and the spring edition of the Price Predictor Index, which has just been released, it makes the note that the only consistency in real estate is that change is inevitable. Could you talk to that point?
Well, yes, right. We often say that the only constant in residential real estate in Australia is change, and change is always happening. And it's those real estate consumers who are aware of the change that's coming can act early and make the most benefit of it, because what usually happens is most people don't become aware of, say, a new market that's starting to boom before they read about it in the media. And by that time, everybody knows about it, and they're piling into a market well, it's already well underway in terms of becoming a boom market, and they're competing with a lot of other buyers. So what we're looking for is early indications of markets that are starting to rise, having previously been slow markets. An example of that would be Melbourne, which right now is very much one of the strongest markets in the country. But we first detected that change in the Melbourne market towards the end of 2024, very early in 2025. So 6 or 9 months ago, we're starting to tell people about it in our Price Predictor Index, that Melbourne, after 2 very poor years in which prices had fallen, was starting to turn and it was starting to rise. We're telling people it was a good time to be considering getting into the Melbourne market, which was very competitively priced compared to other major cities, because it hadn't had the price growth over the last couple of years that Perth, Adelaide and Brisbane had. So that's one example of an early indication that can help people get into a market early, because some parts of the Melbourne market are now quite frenzied. Frankston, for example, is very competitive.
Yeah, so and one of the reasons for that is obviously the affordability factor. So we're obviously looking for markets that are changing all the time, but we've seen over the last couple of years that it's actually been those affordable regions that have actually seen some of the strongest price growth.
Yeah, affordability definitely rules in real estate at the moment, and we're even seeing that in those big city markets, which are quite expensive. But the part of the market that's driving the revival in Sydney right now, and the part of the market that has driven the revival that we've seen in Melbourne over the last 6 or 9 months, is very much the market for attached dwellings. In other words, units, townhouses, apartments, which is the more affordable end of those markets. So the parts of the Sydney market that are showing the strongest revival are the ones that have a very high content in their market, like the inner west of Sydney, where you're typically paying perhaps $2 million for a house, and a lot of people can't afford that, but you can get into the unit market for well under half of that typical price for a house. We're also seeing it very strongly in inner city Melbourne, where very affordable units are available in the Melbourne CBD and near city suburbs like Carlton and Kensington, for example. The Brisbane market, which is one of the strongest in the country right now, the big upturn in sales activity in recent quarters in the Brisbane market has very much been the inner city unit markets.
Yeah. And given affordability is such a big issue here in Australia, how is it that some of the most expensive cities are actually leading the market right now?
Well, it's really that trend where it's the more affordable part of the market that is leading the rise. It's the attached dwellings market, where apartments and units and townhouses are much cheaper for people to get into the market than houses. But also in some of the other markets that are rising strongly, we're seeing Darwin in the last 6 months go from nowhere to becoming perhaps the hottest market in the country right now. And that's been driven by the fact that Darwin is by far the cheapest of the state and territory capital cities. It's probably not going to stay that way for very long. By the end of this year, prices are going to be very much higher in Darwin than they were at the start of the year. But also regional Victoria is another market, a very affordable market, where we're starting to see a big rise in buyer activity there. Places like Bendigo, Ballarat, Shepparton, those markets are showing very strong increases in buyer activity. And part of the reason why people are targeting those areas is they're very affordable places to buy.
Yeah. It's funny, you're talking about, the Price Predictor Index is obviously looking to identify change. And there was an article quite recently that talked about the city that is now taking off that nobody saw coming. Of course, that was Darwin, but it wasn't everybody who didn't see it coming. In fact, you picked that market to be the leader for Australia 9 months ago.
Well, that's right, and that shows the difference between being well-researched property consumers and being consumers who react to media sound bites. Because by the time something shows up in media, and that was a great example, saying the Darwin was the boom market that no one saw coming. Well, we actually did see it coming. We're telling people about it 6 or 8 months before that headline appeared in mainstream media, and that's the essential difference. If you tune into good research, and I think the Price Predictor Index is one of our best reports, and it's a great way for people to get forward knowledge of the places that are going to rise. If you tune into that kind of quality research rather than react to media sound bites, you're going to be 6 or 9 months ahead of the pack.
Yeah. Okay, so at the start of today's episode, I mentioned that the national market had grown by 50% in the last 5 years, but some markets have actually done double that. Could you give us some examples of where they are?
Well, what we've seen for the last 5 years is that the very best performers in the Australian market on price growth, the places that have doubled in value in 5 years, have been affordable regional markets. And they're all places that are featured very strongly in the various editions of the Price Predictor Index, as well as some of our hotspots reports like the National Top 10 Best Buyers report. So many of them are smallish, but very strong regional centres driven by lifestyle factors, infrastructure spend, strong diverse economies. Places like Murray Bridge in South Australia. Yeah. Many of them are places that a lot of Australians haven't really heard of or know very much about. So Murray Bridge in South Australia would be one of those places, but it's led the nation on capital growth for the last 5 years. It's more than doubled in value. Then you have places like Kingaroy in Queensland, again, a smallish regional centre, but one that we know well, and we've been telling people about for a number of years now, because there's just so much activity happening in that economy. And what we know to be true is that real estate markets are very local in nature, and real estate markets arise out of strong local economies. Places like Gympie in Queensland, Maryborough in Queensland, Geraldton in Western Australia, all places that popped up on our radar screen a number of years ago through our analysis in reports like the Price Predictor Index. These are all places where property values have doubled in 5 years and have led the nation on capital growth since 2020.
Yeah, and we've talked obviously about that historically, what's been happening. One of the big benefits of hotspotting research is that we don't look at just real estate data in isolation, and in fact most of the time analysts are looking at it in the rearview mirror, but we also give forward-looking insights. So what can you share with us today that's come out of the spring edition of the Price Predictor Index on what to expect coming forward?
Yeah, one of the things we're always saying to people is that the past does not necessarily inform the future. You cannot assume that the growth leaders of the past 5 years are going to be the growth leaders for the next 5. And so our analysis in the Price Predictor Index tells us about the change that's happening, the new growth leaders, where we're likely to find them. So the spring edition shows that some of the strongest regional markets, the ones that have been leading for the past couple of years, like Queensland and Western Australia, are no longer rising. The peak of those booms has been passed, and that's confirmed by the latest quarterly analysis of the sales activity data. But at the same time, other markets are rising, and there are exceptions to those general rules. The Gold Coast, for example, is an exception to the general trend that we've seen a fall off in sales activity in regional Queensland in the last couple of quarters. The Gold Coast is still pumping strongly. The Sunshine Coast is a market that's on the cusp of another growth phase, having been a national leader sort of around about 2020, 2021, 2022. We've confirmed that the recovery in Melbourne is a very real thing, and it's gone from pretty much a declining market, say 9 months ago, to a national leader on activity right now, and we're going to see that reflected in price data as we go forward in the second half of calendar 2025. Regional Victoria, rather, is also a rising market, doing very similar things to what we're seeing in the greater Melbourne market. Darwin has confirmed itself as being one of the national leaders, one of the hottest markets in the country. But Sydney is the one that's made the greatest strides since the previous edition, since the winter edition, when we had Sydney as still a very mediocre market. But the latest analysis of sales activity has shown there's been a big turn in the Sydney market, led, as I said earlier, by rising market share of attached dwellings units and townhouses and apartments. Demand for that type of product in the Sydney market, the more affordable end of the Sydney market, has very much led the revival that we've seen in this latest analysis in Price Predictor Index.
Very good. Terry Ryder, appreciate your insights as always. Thank you very much. Well, folks, that's the play for today. This program's been brought to you by hotspotting.com.au. This is Ticker. We'll be right back.